Emperor Jorith descended from his shuttle onto the forest floor of Vera 7 and breathed deeply of the cool morning air. He wore hunting armor of polished black metal and carried a ceremonial rifle that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. Behind him walked only 12 guards because he had insisted on a small escort to make the hunt more authentic and exciting. The humans on this world are particularly timid. One of his advisors had told him, "They will provide little sport, but their screams are said to be most satisfying." The Emperor smiled at the memory of those words and raised his rifle to his shoulder as he began walking into the forest. He had hunted humans many times before, and he knew their patterns well. They would run and hide and beg for mercy, and he would grant them none, because mercy was a weakness that emperors could not afford. For the first hour, the forest was silent except for the sounds of birds and wind in the trees. The Emperor grew impatient and ordered his guards to spread out and flush the prey toward him. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. The first guard fell without a sound as a Funrithi blade found the gap in his armor between helmet and collar. The second guard had time to shout a warning before a human arrow pierced his throat. The third and fourth guards turned to face their attackers and found themselves surrounded by shadows that moved with deadly purpose. Within minutes, all 12 guards lay dead on the forest floor, and Emperor Jorith stood alone with his ceremonial rifle clutched in trembling hands. Figures emerged from the trees all around him, and he recognized Funrithi warriors with their silver fur and golden eyes, and human colonists with crude weapons and fierce determination. There were others too, including amphibian creatures he recognized as Thren slaves and insectoid beings that could only be Calthek's factory workers. All of them were looking at him with expressions that held no fear, only a cold and patient hatred. Female Funrithi stepped forward, and the Emperor recognized her with a shock that nearly stopped his heart. "You," he whispered, "I had you executed. Your executioners were careless." "You're Sullivan," replied, "and the human you sent me to as a joke turned out to be more than you could have imagined." She drew her blade and pressed it against his throat hard, enough to draw a thin line of blood. "I have dreamed of this moment for 2 years," she said. "I have imagined all the ways I would make you suffer for what you did to me and my people." The Emperor's scales turned pale with fear, and he dropped his rifle and fell to his knees. "Please," he begged, "I will give you anything you want. Just spare my life." Yura pressed the blade harder and felt his blood warm against her fingers. "There is nothing you can give me that would equal the pain you have caused." She sighed. A hand touched her arm, and she turned to see Yun standing beside her with a calm expression on his weathered face. "Do not do this," he said quietly. "He deserves death," Yura growled. "He deserves worse than death for all the suffering he has inflicted." "Yes, he does," Yun agreed. "But killing him will not bring back the dead, and it will not free your people from the chains of hatred." He stepped past her and looked down at the kneeling Emperor. "You sent her to me as a corpse to mock my grief," Yun said. "You expected me to crumble and provide entertainment for your court." The Emperor stared up at him, unable to comprehend how this simple human had orchestrated his downfall. "Instead, you gave me family," Yun continued. "You meant to prove that humans are weak, but instead you united every species you have wronged." He turned to face the assembled fighters from 4 different worlds. "What do we do with him?" Yura asked, and her blade still hovered at the Emperor's throat. "We show him mercy," Yun said. "Not because he deserves it, but because mercy is who we are." There were murmurs of protest from the crowd, but Yun raised his hand for silence. "If we kill him, he becomes a martyr, and the Empire will rally behind his memory to crush us all," he explained. "But if we send him back alive and humiliated, his own court will tear itself apart fighting over his throne." He looked at the Emperor with an expression that held no hatred, only a kind of weary disappointment. "You are not worth dying for," Yun told him, "and you are not worth killing." They bound the Emperor and recorded a message that was broadcast across every Imperial channel, showing him on his knees, surrounded by the very species he had hunted and enslaved. They documented his cruelty and his cowardice and his begging for mercy from people he had considered less than animals. Then they put him on a shuttle and sent him back to his throne world, where his rivals were already circling like predators, scenting blood within. A month the Empire was in chaos, as 3 different factions claimed the throne and turned their weapons on each other instead of on the subjugated worlds. The fighting would continue for years, but the outer colonies were forgotten in the struggle. And for the first time in centuries, their people knew something like freedom. On Var 7, the snow began to fall again as winter returned to the forest moon. Yura sat in the workshop watching Yun carve a new figure from a piece of dark wood from Rathi. Refugees had begun arriving from across the sector, drawn by word of the wolf woman who had helped bring down an emperor. The colony was growing and changing, and Yun had already begun planning new buildings to house the newcomers. "Can I ask you something?" Yura said. "Always." Yun replied without looking up from his work. "Do your stars truly hear prayers?" Yun smiled and set down his tools. "I do not know," he admitted. "I prayed for family after I lost my wife and daughter, and then you arrived at my door." He held up the figure he had been carving, and Yura saw that it was a wolf standing on its hind legs with its head raised toward the sky. "I prayed for peace," he continued, "and together we built it." He handed her the wooden wolf, and she held it carefully in her clawed hands. "Maybe the stars do not answer prayers," Yum said. "Maybe they just watch and wait to see if we will answer them ourselves." Yura looked at the small figure and thought about everything that had happened since she woke up in a human's home, expecting to find an enemy. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Yun nodded and picked up a new piece of wood to begin his next project. "Thank you for staying," he replied. Outside the workshop window, the snow continued to fall, and the colony lights glowed warm against the darkness above. Then the stars hung in the endless black, indifferent, perhaps, or simply patient, waiting to see what impossible things these unlikely allies would build next. And in a small wooden room on the edge of a forest, on a moon that most of the galaxy had forgotten, a human carpenter and a Fenrithi warrior sat together in comfortable silence, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as family, for that was the human way. And Yura had finally learned that it could be her way too. Spring arrived on Vera 7, and the snows melted away to reveal green forests and rushing streams fed by water from the mountains. Salvin had begun training again in the hours before dawn, when the colony was still asleep and no one could see. Moving through the trees, her body remembered the movements even after 2 years in an Imperial dungeon, and within weeks she had regained much of her former speed and strength. Yun knew what she was doing because he noticed the fresh mud on her boots and the sweat on her fur when she returned each morning, but he did not ask her to stop. He understood that she needed this, and that the warrior inside her could not be suppressed forever. Instead, he focused on his own preparations, which involved sending carefully worded messages through the colony's communication network to contacts he had made over his years of traveling between worlds. He had lived on 7 different planets before settling on Vera 7, and on each one he had built relationships with people who shared his belief that the Empire's cruelty could not continue forever. One morning, Yura intercepted an Imperial communication using equipment she had salvaged from a crashed cargo drone and repaired with Yun's help. The message announced that Emperor Jarth himself would be visiting the sector in 3 weeks for a grand hunting expedition. He planned to travel to the neighboring colony of Varith 4, where he would hunt humans for sport in a tradition that dated back Centauri's Iris. Blood ran cold when she read this, and then it ran hot with a fury she had not felt since the day her unit was betrayed. She brought the information to Yun and told him that this was their chance to strike back against the Emperor who had caused so much suffering. "I can reach him during the hunt," she said with deadly certainty in her voice. The message says he will travel with a minimal escort because he wants an authentic experience without too many guards. And then what? Yoon asked. You kill him and the Empire sends a fleet to burn this moon to ash in retaliation. At least he would be dead. Yura growled. At least there would be some justice for all the lives he has destroyed. Yun set down the piece of wood he was carving and looked at her with an expression that was neither angry nor dismissive, but simply thoughtful. Let me tell you something about humans, he said. When we are cornered and outmatched and facing certain defeat, we do not simply fight harder or accept our fate. He stood up and walked to the window, where he could see the colony spread out below them with its small houses and winding paths. We build, he said. We find others who share our goals, and we build alliances and networks and systems of support that our enemies cannot see or understand. Pretty words, Yura said with frustration. But how does building help us defeat an emperor with 1,000 warships at his command? Yoon turned to face her. The Empire is not as strong as it appears, he said. It rules through fear and division, and it survives because it keeps its subjects isolated from each other. He walked to his workbench and picked up a small wooden token, carved in the shape of a tree. This is my mark, he explained. Every piece of furniture I make carries this symbol, and over the years I have given these tokens to people who believe as I do. A secret network, Yura said as understanding began to dawn. Not secret exactly, Yoon corrected. Just quiet and patient, and scattered across 100 worlds, waiting for the right moment. Over the following days, Yun showed Yura the full extent of what he had built during his decades of wandering. There were Fenrithi resistance cells that had survived the failed rebellion, and were still operating in the shadows. There were humans on a dozen colonies who had suffered under imperial taxation and were ready to resist. There were 3 other species who had been conquered by the Empire and forced into servitude, and who dreamed of freedom. All of them were connected through a network of messengers and coded signals and small wooden tokens that allowed them to identify each other. Why did you never tell me about this? Yura asked. Because you were not ready, Yoon said. You wanted revenge, and revenge would have gotten you killed along with everyone who tried to help you. He placed a hand on her shoulder. Now you are ready to be something more than a weapon, he said. You can be a leader again, but a different kind of leader than you were before. Yura felt something shift inside her as she listened to his words. She had been a good soldier, once following orders and fighting battles that her commanders chose, but she had never questioned whether those battles were the right ones to fight, or whether there might be a better way to achieve victory. What do you need me to do? She asked. I need you to contact the Fenrithi cells and convince them that this is real, Yoon said. They will not trust a human messenger, but they will trust one of their own, especially a decorated sergeant, who was betrayed by the same corruption that plagues their entire species. Yura nodded and began composing the messages that would reach out to her people. Meanwhile, Yun continued his own work, sending tokens and coded phrases to his network of contacts across the sector. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, they had commitments from over 200 Fenrithi, warriors who had been hiding in the wilderness of 3 different planets. They had pledges of support from human colonies, who would provide supplies and shelter and communications relay points. They had alliance offers from the Thren, who were a species of amphibians enslaved to work in the Empire's underwater mining operations, and from the Calthex, who were insectoid beings forced to labor in Imperial factories. Each group had its own grievances and its own reasons to hate the Empire, and Yun's network had given them a way to connect their individual suffering into a collective strength. I never imagined this was possible, Yura admitted as she reviewed the reports coming in from across the sector. It was always possible, Yun said. The Empire never understood that the same cruelty that keeps its subjects afraid also gives them a reason to unite against their oppressors. On the night before the Emperor's hunting expedition was scheduled to begin, a final message went out through the network. It contained coordinates and timing and instructions and a simple phrase that Yun had chosen himself. The stars have heard our prayers. The message read, "Now it is time to answer them ourselves." Yura stood beside Yun on the ridge overlooking the forest where the Emperor would soon arrive, expecting to hunt helpless. Prey below them, hidden among the trees, were Fenrithi warriors and human colonists and Thren fighters and Kalthek soldiers, all waiting in silence. "Are you afraid?" Yun asked her. "Yes," Yura admitted. "But I am also hopeful, and I have not felt hope in a very long time." You nodded and checked the position of the sun. "Then let us give the Emperor a hunt he will never forget," he said, and together they descended into the forest to take their positions. Winter came to Vareth 7 with heavy snows that buried the forest under a blanket of white, and Yura Solvin found herself spending most of her time in Yun Dewan's workshop learning the craft of woodworking. At first, she had simply watched him from her chair as he shaped raw timber into useful objects, but after a few days she grew restless and asked if she could help. Yun handed her a piece of sandpaper and showed her how to smooth the surface of a wooden board using long, even strokes. "This is the most important part of the work," he told her. "Anyone can cut wood into shapes, but the smoothing is what transforms raw material into something beautiful." Yura found the repetitive motion strangely calming, and she worked on that single board for hours until the surface was perfectly smooth beneath her fingers. "Why do you do this work?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the fire eating a simple meal. "You could earn more credits doing something else." Yun considered the question while he chewed his food. "When I was young, I worked in a factory on Earth making components for starships," he said. "The pay was good, but I never saw the finished product, and I never knew who would use the things I made." He gestured around the workshop at the chairs and tables and shelves that filled the space. "When I build a chair, I know that someone will sit in it," he said. "When I build a table, I know that a family will gather around it to share meals, and when I carve a toy, I know that a child will hold it and smile. This connection matters to you," Yura said, and it was not a question. "It matters to all humans." Yun replied, "We need to feel that our work has meaning and that we are contributing something to the world around us." As the weeks passed, Yura learned more than just woodworking from the human carpenter. She learned that he carved toys for the colony's children and never asked for payment in return. She learned that he built furniture for families who could not afford to pay full price and accepted whatever they could offer, even if it was only a basket of vegetables or a jar of preserved fruit. She learned that when storms damaged the homes of his neighbors, he was the first to arrive with his tools and the last to leave after the repairs were complete. One morning, a young human couple came to the workshop with worried expressions on their faces, and Yura retreated to the back room to stay out of sight. She listened as they explained that their roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow and they had no money to pay for repairs because the husband had been injured in the mines and could not work. Yun told them not to worry about payment and spent the next 3 days rebuilding their roof while Yura watched from the edge of the forest. When the work was finished, the couple tried to give him a small pouch of credits they had been saving, but Yun refused to accept it. "Use that money to buy medicine for your husband," he told them. "The roof is my gift to you." That evening, Yura asked him why he had refused payment when he clearly needed the credits himself. "Because they needed it more than I did," Yun said, as if this were the most obvious thing in the world. "But how does your society function if everyone simply gives things away?" Yura asked with genuine confusion. Yun smiled and set down the tool he was holding. "It functions because everyone gives what they can," he said. "When I need help, my neighbors will help me just as I help them, and in this way, we build something stronger than any individual could build alone. You call this a community," Yura said, remembering the word from their earlier conversations. "Yes," Yun agreed. And a community is not built through dominance or fear or obligation, but through countless small kindnesses exchanged over time. Yura thought about this for a long time, and she compared it to the Finrathi way of life where the strongest led and the weakest followed, and loyalty was maintained through force and tradition. She realized that humans had discovered something her people had missed, and that their apparent weakness was actually a different kind of strength. As the winter deepened, Yun built an addition to his home with a separate room for Yura, so she would no longer have to sleep in the cold storage area. She protested that this was too much work and too generous a gift, but he simply shook his head. "You are not a guest anymore," he said. "You live here, and this is your home for as long as you want it to be." Word began to spread through the colony that the Carpenter had taken in a strange, wolf-like alien, and some of the humans were afraid. They remembered stories of the Finrathi as savage warriors who had fought brutal wars against the Empire, and they worried that this one might be dangerous. But others remembered how Yun had helped them in their times of need, and they trusted his judgment. These neighbors began leaving small gifts outside the workshop door, such as extra food and warm clothing, and even a bottle of wine that must have cost someone a week's Wagasira. Was amazed by this generosity shown to a stranger and an alien and a former enemy. "Your people confuse me," she admitted to Yun one evening. "I was taught that all other species were either predators to be feared or prey to be conquered, but you do not fit into either category. Perhaps that is because we are neither," Yun suggested. "Perhaps we are simply neighbors trying to survive in a hostile universe and looking out for each other along the way." The peaceful winter was interrupted one morning by the arrival of Imperial tax collectors who landed their shuttle in the center of the colony and began making demands. Yura hid in her room and listened through the thin walls as the collectors informed Yun that his taxes had been tripled by order of the regional governor. Amount they demanded was more than Yun earned in an entire year. And if he failed to pay, they would seize his workshop and his home and everything he owned. Yun did not argue or complain or beg for mercy, simply nodded and agreed to pay, because he knew that resistance would only bring more soldiers and more suffering to the entire colony. After the collectors left, Yura emerged from her room with fury burning in her golden eyes. "How can you accept this?" she demanded. "They are stealing from you, and you simply allow it. What would you have me do?" Yun asked calmly. "If I fight them, they will kill me, and then they will punish the entire colony for my resistance. There must be something we can do." Yura insisted, and she felt the old fire awakening in her chest, the fire that had driven her to become a soldier and fight against the Empire. Yun looked at her and saw the warrior she had once been emerging from beneath the wounded refugee she had become. "Perhaps there is," he said quietly, "but it will require more than just fighting." Yura leaned forward, eager to hear his plan. "Tell me what you have in mind," she said. "I am ready to use my claws again." Yun shook his head. "Your claws alone cannot defeat an empire," he said, "but perhaps together we can build something that can." 2 weeks passed on the forest moon of Vareth 7, and during that time, Yun Daewon barely slept more than a few hours each night. As he worked to keep the wolf woman alive, he learned quickly that Finrathi biology was different from human biology in ways that made his task even more difficult. Her body temperature ran much lower than a human's, and when he kept the room too warm, she would sweat and shake as if she had a fever. Through trial and error, he discovered that she needed the room to be cool, almost cold by human standards, and so he moved her to his storage room, where the temperature stayed constant throughout the day. He wrapped himself in extra clothing and kept working. Food was another challenge because he did not know what Finrathi could eat, and he had no way to ask her while she remained unconscious. Tried different things, starting with simple broths made from the local vegetables and then moving to small pieces of fish that he caught in the stream behind his workshop. She seemed to respond best to raw meat, which made sense. given her wolf-like appearance, and so he began hunting small game in the forest to provide her with fresh food. The surveillance drones continued to watch and transmit footage back to the throne world, but Emperor Jorath had already lost interest in what he considered a failed experiment. The human was not crying or raging or doing anything entertaining, and the Emperor had many other diversions to occupy his attention. On the 15th day, Urisolvan opened her eyes for the first time. Yun was sitting beside her bed, carving a small wooden figure to pass the time when he heard her breathing change and looked up to find her golden eyes staring at him with wild fear and confusion. Before he could speak or move, she launched herself at him with her claws extended and her teeth bared in a snarl that came from deep in her chest. Claws raked across his arm, drawing blood, and her weight knocked him backward off his chair and onto the floor. She pinned him there with one hand around his throat and her other hand raised to strike, and for a moment, Yun was certain he was about to die, but he did not fight back. He did not raise his hands to defend himself or try to push her away or call for help. He simply looked into her eyes and spoke in a calm, quiet voice. "You are safe here," he said. "I am not going to hurt you." Yura hesitated with her claws still raised and her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to understand what was happening. In her experience, no one was ever safe, and no one ever helped without expecting something in return. She released his throat and stumbled backward until her back hit the wall, and she crouched there shaking and confused. Sat up slowly and looked at the blood running down his arm from the wounds her claws had made. "I am going to bandage this," he said in the same calm voice, "and then I am going to bring you some food, because you have not eaten properly in 2 weeks. He stood up and walked to his supply cabinet and began wrapping his arm with clean cloth while Yura watched him with suspicion and fear. Over the following days, she attacked him 3 more times, always when he entered the room unexpectedly or made a sudden movement that startled her. The second attack broke 2 of his ribs when she threw him against the wall. The third attack dislocated his shoulder when she grabbed his arm and twisted. The fourth attack broke his left arm when she struck him with her full strength. Each time Yun did not fight back, and each time he simply waited for her to calm down and then continued caring for her as if nothing had happened. He set his own broken bones as best he could using splints made from wood, and he kept bringing her food and water and speaking to her in that same calm voice. Yura could not understand this human in Fenrithi culture. Showing weakness to an enemy was the same as inviting death, and any warrior who allowed themselves to be injured without retaliation would be considered a coward and a fool. But this human kept coming back no matter how many times she hurt him, and he never showed any anger or resentment or fear. On the 20th day, she finally spoke to him in a voice that was rough from disuse. "Why do you help me?" she asked. "Your kind gains nothing from this." Yun was changing the bandage on his arm when she spoke, and he paused to consider her question before answering. "You needed help," he said simply. "That is enough." Yura shook her head because this answer made no sense to her. "I have attacked you 4 times, she said. "I have broken your bones and drawn your blood and given you nothing but violence in return for your kindness." "Yes," Yun agreed without any accusation in his voice. "Then why do you continue?" Yura demanded. "What do you want from me?" Yun finished bandaging his arm and looked at her with an expression she could not read. "I want nothing from you," he said. "When my grandmother was dying, she told me that the only things we truly own are the choices we make, and I choose to help you because that is who I am." He stood up and walked toward the door. "There is food on the table," he said. "Eat when you are hungry and rest when you are tired, and when you feel strong enough, you are free to leave." He left the room and closed the door behind him, and Yura sat alone in the darkness trying to understand what kind of creature would endure so much pain without any hope of reward. She thought about his words for a long time, and she realized that she had never met anyone like this. Human before, the Fenrithi valued strength and dominance and loyalty to the pack. The Kethvari valued power and cruelty and the submission of lesser beings. But this human seemed to value something entirely different, and she did not have a word for it. In her language, she ate the food he had left for her, and for the first time since waking up, she did not feel afraid. The next morning, she emerged from the storage room and found Yun working at his bench, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a small animal. He looked up when she entered, but he did not flinch or move away or show any sign of fear. "Good morning," he said, as if she were a neighbor stopping by for a visit, instead of a dangerous predator who had nearly killed him multiple times. Sierra sat down on a chair across from him and watched him work in silence for several minutes. "I want to understand," she said finally. "Teach me about your people and why you are the way you are." You nodded and continued carving. "That will take some time," he said. "But I have nothing but time, and you are welcome to stay as long as you need." And so began a new chapter in both their lives. The cold wind swept across the forest moon of Var 7 as Yun Day 1 finished his work for the day and placed his tools back on the wooden rack he had built with his own hands 3 years ago. When he first arrived on this distant world, he was the only carpenter in the small mining colony, and the humans here depended on him for everything from furniture to roof repairs to the small wooden toys he carved for the children during the long winter months. Yun was a quiet man of 42 years, with gray starting to show in his black hair and calluses covering his palms from decades of working with wood, and he rarely spoke more than necessary. But everyone in the colony knew they could count on him. 3 years had passed since the accident that took his wife Minji and his daughter Soman when a mining tunnel collapsed without warning and buried them along with 11 other colonists. He never spoke about that day, but the other humans saw how he threw himself into his work and how he never refused to help anyone, even when they could not pay him. Far across the galaxy on the throne world of the Kethvari Empire sat Emperor Jorth, surrounded by advisors and entertainers who competed for his attention and favor. Kethvari were tall beings with scaled skin, the color of burnished copper, and eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. And they had ruled this sector of space for 800 years with an iron grip. Emperor Jorth considered himself a connoisseur of suffering, and he took great pleasure in finding new ways to humiliate the lesser species that lived under his rule. Humans were his favorite targets because they were so emotional and so easily broken by psychological torment. One of his intelligence officers brought him a report about a lonely human carpenter on a remote forest moon who had lost his family and lived alone at the edge of a mining settlement. The emperor laughed when he heard this, and his advisors laughed with him because they knew better than to remain silent when he found something amusing. These humans and their attachments, the emperor said, with contempt dripping from every word. They form bonds like insects and then crumble when those bonds are severed. He thought for a moment, and then a cruel smile spread across his scaled face as an idea formed in his mind. "I shall send him a gift," the emperor announced. "A companion for the lonely ape. In the dungeons beneath the throne world, there was a prisoner awaiting execution named Urisolvan, who belonged to the Fenrithi species. The Fenrithi were wolf-like beings covered in thick fur with powerful builds and sharp teeth, and they had rebelled against the Empire 5 years ago in a war that ended in their complete defeat. Yura had been a sergeant in the Fenrithi military, and she had fought bravely until her own commander betrayed her unit and sold them to the Empire in exchange for political favors. She had spent 2 years in the dungeons, enduring interrogation and torture, and now she was scheduled to die for the crime of treason against the emperor. The executioners carried out their work that evening, using a neural disruptor that was designed to stop all brain function instantly and permanently. They wrapped her body in imperial cloth and placed it in a cargo pod with a message attached that read, "A companion for the lonely ape along with the Emperor's personal seal. The pod was launched toward Vareth 7 and arrived 3 days later, crashing into the forest, half a kilometer from Yun's workshop surveillance. Drones followed the pod's descent and positioned themselves to record the humans' reaction, because the Emperor wanted to watch his victims Desperian heard the crash and walked through the snow-covered trees until he found the pod lying in a crater of broken branches and scorched earth. He opened it carefully, not knowing what to expect, and found the body of a wolf woman wrapped in purple cloth with the mocking message pinned to her chest. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at her still form and reading the cruel words again. And again, the surveillance drones transmitted his image back to the throne world, where the Emperor watched with anticipation, waiting for the human to break down in tears or rage. But Yun did neither of those things. Instead, he knelt beside the body and placed 2 fingers against her neck, just below her jaw where he could feel for a pulse. The Fenrithi were warm-blooded mammals like humans, and he knew their hearts beat in a similar rhythm. At first he felt nothing, and he was about to pull his hand away when something stopped him. There was a flutter beneath his fingertips so faint that he thought he had imagined it, but then it came again and again in a weak but steady pattern. She was alive. Yun did not know how this was possible, because the neural disruptor should have killed her instantly, but he knew enough about alien biology to understand that different species could react differently to the same weapons. Perhaps the Fenrithi had some natural defense against neural attacks. Or perhaps her body had entered a death-like state to protect itself from the trauma. He did not waste time wondering about the reasons. He lifted her carefully in his arms, surprised by how light she was despite her height, and began carrying her back through the forest toward his home. The surveillance drones recorded everything and transmitted the footage to the Emperor, who watched with growing confusion as the human appeared to be taking the corpse home with him. What is he doing? The Emperor asked his advisors. Does he intend to keep her body as some kind of trophy? The advisors had no answer, and the Emperor shrugged and turned his attention to other matters, because watching a human grieve over a dead body was not as entertaining as he had hoped. Back on Vareth 7, Yun carried Yira into his workshop and laid her on the wooden table where he usually worked on his projects. He checked her pulse again and found it slightly stronger than before, and her chest was rising and falling in shallow breaths that misted in the cold air. He did not know anything about Fenrithi medicine, but he knew that she needed warmth. And so he built up the fire in his stove until the room was almost uncomfortably hot for a human. Then he covered her with every blanket he owned and began boiling water, because hot water was useful for almost everything. As he worked, he remembered something his grandmother had told him when he was a young boy growing up in a small village on Earth. The stars hear prayers spoken through action, not words. She had said, when you help someone without expecting anything in return, you are speaking directly to the universe. Yun had prayed many times since losing his wife and daughter, but he had never felt that anyone was listening. Now, as he looked at the dying wolf woman on his table, he realized that this was not about prayer or faith or cosmic justice. This was simply about doing what needed to be done. She needed help and he could provide it, and that was enough. He worked through the night, monitoring her breathing and keeping the fire burning and dripping water into her mouth. When she seemed capable of swallowing by morning, her pulse was stronger and her breathing was deeper, and Yun allowed himself to feel a small spark of hope. Did not know who she was or what she had done, or why the Emperor had sent her to him as a cruel joke, but none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that she was alive, and he would do everything in his power to keep her that way. Stars might not hear prayers, and the universe might not care about justice, but young Daewon cared, and sometimes that had to be enough.